Margaret Poston, president of Over Parkinson's, and today, in conjunction with our Pop Profile series, we have Dr. Kathleen Poston, professor of neurology and neurological sciences and neurosurgery, as well as the chief of the movement disorders division at Stanford University. Dr. Poston, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, I know a lot of our listeners are interested to hear what's happening in the Poston Lab, so I'd love to just jump right in and get started.
Absolutely. Let's go for it.
Well, as we know, so much of the treatments and therapeutics revolve around the motor symptoms of Parkinson's. So as we start thinking about the myriad of non-motor symptoms that accompany the disease, as well as really nothing altering the trajectory of the disease, the Poston Lab really aims to bridge that treatment gap between the therapeutical and surgical options and those non-motor symptoms that we mentioned. To bridge this gap, the lab's using functional and structural neuroimaging. So share with our listeners what neuroimaging is and how it really works.
Absolutely. So neuroimaging is any type of brain scan, whether it's a CT scan, an MRI scan, or a PET scan that takes pictures of the brain in different ways. And the reason why this is so important in trying to understand these non-motor aspects of Parkinson's disease is that we think the places in the brain where those non-motor symptoms come from, the circuits that are involved, they're a little bit different than where the traditional motor symptoms come from. And what I mean by that, the tremor, the slowness, the stiffness, and some of the walking difficulties. There's definitely some overlap, but there's some unique features. And those unique features, we believe, are why traditional medications that are really helpful with the motor symptoms, like dopamine replacement or STN or GPID brain stimulation, really don't do much, unfortunately, to help most of those non-motor symptoms. So if we could identify where in the brain they're coming from, we do that with MRI, which gives us a wonderful spatial resolution. We can see really good details of where things are in the brain. Or if we can understand the circuitry, we do that with what we call functional MRI, where we actually have people do different types of cognitive or memory tasks in the brain. And we see which areas of the brain light up or are activated when we have them do certain things. Or when we look at different types of protein changes in the brain, looking at PET scans, which is a form of brain scan where you actually look for specific molecules in the brain that are there or not there in different locations. And so those are all, the goal is to give us locational targets, circuitry targets, and protein targets, which might help us eventually develop much better therapies for those non-motor symptoms.
Yeah, if we can elaborate, you kind of segued really nicely into the PET imaging. If we can elaborate on that piece and the protein that you mentioned, you received a grant from the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke to examine how the tau protein levels may lead to cognitive impairment associated with those with Parkinson's. So share a little bit more about that study and potential benefits that would be coming out of assessing the connection between the tau protein and Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, absolutely. So until we had these better PET techniques, the only way we could really assess what protein abnormalities were associated with different neurodegenerative diseases was after a person passed away and they donated their brain to research. And we'd look at it under a microscope and we could say, oh, look, they have Lewy bodies in their brain. They have these other proteins like amyloid and tau in their brain. And those were great and very, very important studies. And over time, it became quite obvious that while everybody with Parkinson's disease, for the most part, really has those abnormal Lewy bodies, which are a protein made up of a protein of alpha-synuclein, which we all have in our brain. It's normal there. It's supposed to be there. It's supposed to function. But for some reason, it changes its conformation and clumps together, and that creates the Lewy bodies. So almost everyone with Parkinson's disease have those. But in addition, about 50 to 70% of people with Parkinson's disease also have an additional protein in their brain, either the amyloid protein or the tau protein. Again, normal proteins, important for normal functioning, but they become sticky, they change conformation, they clump together, and they cause problems. So not everybody has tau protein, but when it's there, it's highly associated with more memory problems. And in fact, the tau protein is the one that's abnormal in people with Alzheimer's disease as well. So we consider this a multiple pathology or a dual pathology diagnosis when people have it. The big question is, though, is that maybe this is just something that happens in the 6 to 8 months before somebody passes away as they get older, and it really has no impact on their life with Parkinson's. Because as we all know, someone with Parkinson's can live 10, 20 plus years with Parkinson's disease. What if this never is really important during life? And we couldn't answer that question with autopsy studies.
Right.
What we're very happy about is that there is now a way to visualize that tau protein, an FDA approved ligand. There are a couple of them that are out now, where we can actually do this PET scan and look for that abnormal tau protein in people with Parkinson's disease during life. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to do is answer the question, does this happen in people during life? And if it does it change the trajectory of their cognitive impairment? Mm-hmm. And the reason this is really important is because there are active therapies currently being developed that try to eliminate that tau protein in people with Alzheimer's disease. Mm-hmm. And our hypothesis is if we do identify certain people with Parkinson's disease who have early accumulation of this tau protein, they might be candidates for one of those therapies should one of them eventually get FDA approved. So we're trying to get ahead of the curve, that we want to answer a question in anticipation of a possible therapeutic that we know is in the pipeline for another disease, to see if it's going to be relevant for our patients with Parkinson's or not. So we have an answer to that by the time there's something available. Yeah.
And now having the luxury of being able to assess the brain prior to decease.
That's right. Yeah.
Fantastic. I know that changes the game.
Really does. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it fair to suggest that a potential result of this study, as we talked about, would neuroimaging biomarkers be created to more accurately, we talked about treating, but more accurately diagnose Parkinson's?
So we're working on that. We're not quite there yet. We have this wonderful ligand that helps to identify tau protein. There's another one that helps to identify the amyloid protein. We're really missing a PET ligand to specifically identify that Lewy body or alpha-synuclein ligand. There's been a lot of work that's gone into that, but it's not quite there yet. There were some results that were just shown actually a month and a half ago at an international AD/PD meeting that it looked promising, but I'll just say right now, it did not bind to the Lewy bodies in Parkinson's disease patients. It bound to the alpha-synuclein in a different disease, people with this disease called multiple system atrophy. But it's a huge step forward to even have something close. So we're not quite there yet, but that is a major goal. And I think in the next couple of years, we will have a strong candidate PET tracer that will identify Lewy bodies. I'm very hopeful that is just on the horizon. Yeah,
well, that's fantastic and a great takeaway. Moving on to the lumbar puncture. The lab also uses lumbar puncture to obtain cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, which is the fluid that surrounds the brain and spinal cord. Explain what's entailed in analyzing CSF and how it can lead to breakthroughs.
Yeah, so CSF has really been one of the most important research tools we have used over the last 2 decades. So cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid that bathes the brain. It actually circulates throughout the brain. It's almost like a blood supply almost for the brain. It bathes the brain kind of floats in the cerebrospinal fluid, but it has a very high turnover rate. So it's constantly being reabsorbed and recreated. And through that process, these proteins that are in the brain get recycled through the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid actually gives us a glimpse of what all the different proteins are in the brain at that moment without actually having to take a chunk of brain. Right. So you can get a glimpse of all these different proteins simply through a couple of tubes of that cerebrospinal fluid. And we get it through a needle that goes into the small of the back below the level of the spinal cord. It's a very safe procedure. Especially now it's been refined over years. And it can, the one potential side effect is a bit of a headache that happens about 1 in every 100 patients. But otherwise a very safe procedure to do. And we can get that fluid, which basically tells us what proteins are in the brain. So we can detect this amyloid, this tau, this alpha-synuclein, as well as hundreds of other proteins that can tell us about inflammation in the brain. It can give us the glucose, the sugar levels in the brain. So how well is the brain using energy? So in just that one lumbar puncture, we can get hundreds of pieces of information. Whereas the PET scan, while it's not as invasive, it only tells you about one protein at a time. So each PET scan is a single protein. So it would be a different scan for tau, a different scan for amyloid, and eventually a different scan for cerebral for alpha synuclein. So they both have pros and cons, but the cerebrospinal fluid is our best way of getting a snapshot of everything that's happening in the brain all at once.
Okay. And related, as we move on to kind of the first line therapy, dopamine replacement therapy, what impact does it have? Does it worsen? Does it improve cognition? What role does it play in one's cognition related to their disease?
It's a great question. So dopamine replacement therapy is, as I mentioned before, really fantastic at treating a lot of the motor symptoms. While we do see maybe a little bit of impact on cognition, it's not a big one, either in the plus or the minus range. I did a lot of studies early on where we would do these different cognitive tests with people on their medication versus off their medication. And I was there for all the studies, and I'd always ask patients, like, did you feel like you did better today or worse today than you did on your on or off day? And patients responded in both directions. Some people thought they did so much better on the on medication day because they were just more focused, more alert. And then other people felt like they were a little foggier when they were on their medication. But when we actually looked at the data of how well they actually performed, very mild differences between the on and the off. So it doesn't seem to make a big difference in either direction. So there's something else going on other than just dopamine that's affecting cognition.
Right. Okay. And do we know, or is there evidence emerging why some people with Parkinson's do develop the memory cognition symptoms versus those who do not really experience that side of Parkinson's?
It's a really important question. We don't have a completely clear answer, but we have had a few things emerge that give us some hints. So one of them is that people who do develop these co-pathologies, whether it's the amyloid, the tau, or another one is vascular co-pathology, people who have a lot of small mini strokes, people who are more prone to vascular disease, vascular heart disease, vascular brain disease. That tends to increase the risk of the cognitive impairment. What we think of that as multiple hits to the brain. You've got the Parkinson's disease, and then you add something else onto it. There's only so much the brain can take, and that will lead to the cognitive impairment. Patients who are older are more prone to some of the cognitive impairment. Again, aging itself is a bit of for all of us, unfortunately, a bit of a hit to the brain. All of our brains are getting a little bit more tired as we all get older. And so aging is one of those. We are looking into different genetic things that could predispose to either protecting the brain from cognitive impairment or increasing the risk of cognitive impairment. It's not entirely clear, but it looks like there are some genetic markers that might push in one direction or another. So we're still figuring that out. I'd say the one that we have the most information on is these co-pathologies. And so that's why we focus a lot on those, because they're also things that could be actionable and could be treatable in addition to the Parkinson's disease.
If I can elaborate on that a little bit, would the root cause of the disease play into whether the cognitive impairments are present in the disease? So if Parkinson's comes on because of head trauma, is it more likely to have those cognitive symptoms? And, I'm just throwing things on the ceiling and asking the expert, is there any connection, or has that not been examined yet?
It's a really important question. I would say my gut is that, yes, that does make a difference, but we don't my hypothesis would be that, but we don't exactly have the proof to show that. The general principle that seems to be playing out is that the more things that are impacting the brain, especially in light of aging, the bigger risk that there is a cognitive impairment in there. So if head trauma was a leading cause, particularly of the development of Parkinson's disease itself, that probably will lead to a higher risk, but we don't know for sure yet.
It sounds like there's almost a cumulative effect, to your point, in terms of how much the brain can handle. If there's accumulation of certain circumstances, then there might be a higher likelihood.
Yeah, exactly. That's the model that we're currently using. Again, the details still need proven and shown out, but that's definitely the model that we're working under.
Okay. So as we talked about the current therapies, dopamine replacement therapies, et cetera, what do you believe is the first line treatment for someone who's newly diagnosed with the disease?
It's a great question. I'm going to say
it's a snowflake disease. So
every patient is completely different. But the one thing that I will say every single patient newly diagnosed absolutely has to include in their first line therapy is exercise.
Absolutely.
And I do, in fact, see exercise as an active treatment. It's not a, hey, do this in case you want to, or it might be good to add on. I see it as a first line therapy that no matter who you are, even if you cannot walk, you can still do some exercises. There's things that can be done for people at every single level of the disease. And it is, when we think of the multiple hits that harm the brain, this is one of the things that actually improves the brain, right? And so it's that balance between things. You're giving the brain positive things, and exercise is one of them. And we don't fully understand how it works, whether it's by reducing the inflammation or increasing growth factors. There's a lot of hypotheses around there. But I will say definitively, every study that has looked at exercise versus not exercise has shown that exercise helps. So that is the one thing I would say is my first line treatment, no matter what.
We agree. We absolutely agree. Well, what would you say is the biggest barrier to advancements in the treatment options, as well as ultimately discovering a cure? What's the barrier? Is it funding? What do you think?
Well,
of course, it's always funding, right? It's always funding.
So I think that that the two things that I hear the most about when I talk to pharmaceutical companies about their concerns with moving forward to these really groundbreaking phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials in Parkinson's disease, which we are on the cusp of having many of them. One of them is really having a good, what we say, primary outcome measure. Okay. So in order to get something FDA approved, you have to, before you start your study, you have to say in your phase 2 clinical trial, this is the one primary outcome measure that it all hangs on. And, now that we all sort of have this experience with COVID, it's sort of a good thing to think about, right? With the vaccine trials, the primary outcome measure was, the difference between the number of people who became COVID positive over a certain period of time, right? And there were less people in the vaccine trials versus the people who were in the placebo group. But they looked at a lot of other things. But if they hadn't reached that one primary outcome measure, they would not have had a successful trial. And that's how Parkinson's trials are. You have to pick one outcome measure. The problem is we don't have that linchpin of an outcome measure that definitively says you slowed the progression of the disease or you did not. What we use right now is the clinical exam, which can be influenced by a lot of things that have nothing to do with the disease progression. Like the person got a good night's sleep last night. Did they exercise this morning? What was their diet like this morning? Did the meds kick in correctly? And so it's just not a great outcome measure. And that makes the studies very hard. And so a lot of us are trying to work on something that is very objective, that's not influenced by medication, not influenced by the night's sleep, that truly says, hey, this disease is not as bad as it would have been had you not taken this drug.
Right. That's very interesting. I hadn't thought of or heard that perspective. So thank you for sharing that angle. As we talk more about, of course, the disease and it being synonymous with really the tremor. So folks who aren't in the disease, in the business of Parkinson's, associate the disease with a tremor and those involuntary movements. So if you could cast a light on a symptom, a little known symptom that is incorporated in the disease, what would it be?
Yeah, so we already talked about cognitive impairment, so I'm not going to talk about that one. I think one that probably has a really impact on quality of life that most people are unaware of is blood pressure fluctuations. So it doesn't happen in everybody, but when it does happen, it can have a really big impact. So people with Parkinson's disease are more prone to drops in their blood pressure when they stand up, particularly if they've been sitting down for a long time or laying down for a long time. And those drops in blood pressure can be very disabling. They can lead to falls, they can lead to confusion. And it doesn't always happen just when people stand up. It can sometimes happen completely out of the blue. The term we use for this is orthostatic hypotension, meaning as you change your position, orthostasis, you get this low blood pressure. The good news is we do have some medications that can help with this. The bad news is that this is one of those symptoms that actually the dopamine medications can make worse. And so we have to be really careful about that. And so that's one that's always really important, because some people don't think, oh, I'm feeling lightheaded when I stand up. That must be my blood pressure medications or my heart. Sometimes they don't even think to tell their neurologist. And so if we don't ask as the neurologist, sometimes we don't even know. And so it's an important one for patients to be aware of and to tell their doctor about, because it might require a change in their dopamine medications or a change in other medications. And again, when people fall because their blood pressure drops, they fall hard because it's a pass out. You lose consciousness and you just drop and you hit whatever's around you. So it can be very, very dangerous to patients. So that's an important one for people to be aware of, just so that they know to talk to their doctor about it.
I also think about that, you shining a light on that symptom as folks, even pre-diagnosis, as so many people are trying to figure out what's happening, because a myriad of symptoms are happening, but they can't piece it together that it's Parkinson's. So by shining a light on some of these other pieces, people can more quickly understand maybe what's happening and go to the neurologist sooner. So
that's right. That's right. Absolutely.
I think people just think, well, I don't have Parkinson's because I don't have a
tremor.
Or a tremor. But understanding these small things are very important too. Well, globally, and certainly within your lab, there's so much exciting research going on. So in addition to some of the projects you've shared, what are some of the research endeavors that you're really excited to see coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, I think the two things that are the most exciting is the, first of all, there's different facets of the same idea. One of them is that we are finally moving toward having real clinical trials for the non-motor symptoms. They're getting out there. They're getting out there slowly, but it's important to, again, treat patients as individuals, and not just, we've had this wonderful medication since 1970, but everybody has different types of symptoms, and their medication should reflect their symptoms. And so finally having some things coming down the pipeline that are specifically tailored toward all these different non-motor symptoms, I think is very important. The other side is thinking about people as individuals, not just from their symptoms, but also from the cause of their Parkinson's. We're just on the cusp of, there are a couple of clinical trials happening that are specifically in people with specific gene mutations that increase the risk of Parkinson's. And so again, moving toward that personalized approach, that if you have this certain genetic profile, you might be a good candidate for this medication. We've been doing this for about a decade now in cancer therapies, right? So if someone has cancer, one of the first things they do is they genetically profile that cancer. And depending on the genetic profile, they may be a candidate for different types of therapies. We're not there yet in Parkinson's, but we are moving in that direction. And so I foresee a day when I first diagnose somebody, we do some series of tests, either genetic tests or protein analysis profile tests. And based on that, they're candidates for regimen A or regimen B or regimen C. And so not just tailoring medications to symptoms, but tailoring them to the underlying biology, which I think is very different in different patients. And we're just starting to move in that direction. And that's where I see things being in the next decade.
Yeah. And having the research, what you noted, having the research around the non-motor symptoms and people taking an active role in discovering treatments and different therapeutics kind of leads me into my next question, because there is a sense of control when you can participate in study and almost have an impact on the disease trajectory. Maybe not in this lifetime, but going forward, I think there's a lot to be said for people who might not have the tremor, but can still participate in these studies now that they're becoming more common and more prevalent. So my question is, how can our listeners, both those with PD and without, because we need the people without Parkinson's as well, to get involved in clinical trials? Where would you tell them to go?
It's a great question. The official place that has most of this information is a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And every interventional clinical trial that's taking place in the United States, as well as ones that are taking out throughout the world, are registered on clinicaltrials.gov. You cannot bring a therapeutic to FDA approval without registering your clinical trial on clinicaltrials.gov. The problem is that this is a government-run website, and it's a little bit challenging to find your way around, even when you know what you're doing, like I do. And so it's a little cumbersome to get your way around that. But that is a good place to, you can put in where you live and see what's going on. I do really like the website from the Michael J. Fox Foundation as well. They have a couple of really good websites. Fox Trial Finder is another really good one that has a lot of information. And that's a great place to go for people who again, they don't have Parkinson's disease, but they want to help and do something because they'll have a lot of observational studies like the ones I do, where we're trying to understand the disease, but we have to compare with normal older adults. And the reason for that is that, as I mentioned, aging is a really critical component in the risk of developing Parkinson's. So I have to make sure that what I'm seeing, like in that protein profile or in that imaging profile, isn't simply due to the aging effect, that it's aging plus Parkinson's. And so I need to have the comparison of people in that age range and looking at what happens as part of aging versus what happens as part of aging and Parkinson's. So I always ask, whenever there's a non-Parkinson's patient who participates in my research, who are you here? Who are you here for? Who are you here on behalf of? And everybody has a story. My sister, my aunt, my college roommate, so those of you out there with Parkinson's disease, when your friends ask, gosh, is there something I can do? The best answer is go on to either clinicaltrials.gov or the Michael J. Fox Foundation website and find a local study that you can participate in as a healthy control on my behalf. And that's what will make a difference. Yeah.
It's very well said. And it allows care partners, loved ones, friends to be an active role in the trajectory of the disease.
That's right.
Well, Dr. Poston, how can our listeners learn more about you and your research? And if they're near Stanford University, how can they get involved?
Yeah, so we try to keep our website up to date with and if you just Google Poston Lab Stanford, it comes up as on the as a website option, and we have try to have updates on our clinical trials as well as what we're recruiting in. The big one that we're primarily recruiting into right now is this NIH funded study. Again, this longitudinal observational study where we're following people with Parkinson's disease at all stages, healthy older adults of all ages, as well as actually individuals with Alzheimer's disease and pre-Alzheimer's disease, looking across the aging spectrum and trying to understand these different elements of neurodegeneration and where the ideal intervention spots are, contrasting these different diseases. And anybody who's in our observational clinical trials, should interventional trials become available, they're always welcome to join those as well. And they're often the first ones to hear about that. So go to our website, and that should have all the information about our ongoing studies. But I also very strongly encourage anybody to go to their local sites and to see what all they can participate in. We truly cannot find these answers without humans who are willing to take a step forward and be part of the solution, because otherwise we're very limited in what we can do without people being willing to be partners with us in research.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll share all of these websites at the end in our ending slide. So we'll
Wonderful.
Get that out as well. Well, Dr. Poston, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. And thank you so much for being a wonderful host and so informed and and being so proactive in getting information out to people with Parkinson's and their families. It's really helpful, I think, to be well informed about the disease so that you can go into every clinic visit with as much information as possible. So glad I could help.
Thank you.